But thanks for coming out. Those of you who have had the opportunity to look at Channel 12 for the last 5 days will probably see what we were talking about earlier. We were talking about the birth of the British Royal Navy, and today we're going to look at the Armada, which was one of the big events of, one of the big naval battles of all time, was the defeat of the Armada. And then we're going to move on just at the end to jump forward a couple of hundred years and look at the American War of Independence. For those of you that were here last time, or those of you that have seen the program on Channel 12, you may remember that right at the end we talked about Francis Drake was out causing great mischief around the world. King Philip was the micromanager. Every decision had to go across his desk, and it would take 2 or 3 months for a letter to get from Mexico to Madrid and back again. So there was an opportunity for much mischief. And one of the things that Francis Drake did, apart from circumnavigating the globe while he was doing it, was to go up the southwestern coast of America, so up the western coast of South America, and managed to locate one of the big bullion vessels that was coming up from Lima in Peru. Actually made his fortune. It was like winning the lottery 20 times over. It was a vessel called the Nuestra Senora de la Concepcion, and it was, as I say, an unarmed vessel, but it was stuffed with bullion. He took that vessel and carried on around the world, past the southern tip of Africa, back to Plymouth in England, and arrived back in 1580. He started out in 1577 and arrived back in 1580. Shows the sort of length of time that things happened in that time. It took a long time for communications to happen. It took a long time for voyages to happen. But eventually Philip was getting upset with that amount of mischief making, and so he started to plan for the invasion of England. Unfortunately, the planning of the invasion did not go at all well, because the original proposer of the invasion was this gentleman, Marquis of Santa Cruz. He was Philip's best admiral, and he unfortunately died from a typhus epidemic that was decimating the fleet. And that fleet was still sitting idle in Lisbon. His replacement was a gentleman called the Duke of Medina Sidonia. And he was more of an admin guy than a seafarer, and he often got a rough deal from English historians. They viewed him as really incompetent, but that wasn't really the case. He did have one character flaw which was pretty important for a leader. He had no independent judgment. So he had a lack of willingness to jettison any plans and rely on his instinct. Whatever was written in the orders, that's what he did. All the great Royal Navy commanders through history, they had that killer instinct. Drake and Blake and Hawke and Nelson. And even this gentleman, the recently departed Marquis of Santa Cruz, had the supreme self-confidence and overreaching ego that breeds the killer instinct. The Armada fleet was impressive. More than 130 ships, 30,000 men, of which 18,000 were foot soldiers. Only 50% of the ships were Spanish or Portuguese. The biggest and best was San Francesco, which belonged to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. However, there was a lack of experienced sailors and lack of supplies. Originally loaded with 8 months of supplies, they were down to 4 months by May. And when the fleet sailed on the 28th of May, some ships were already running short of food and water. But the biggest shortage was guns. The English fleet was heavily armed with the prolific cast iron English gun. Medina Sidonia was not happy or confident. The plan called for the fleet to sail for Ireland to draw the English fleet out of the Channel. This would allow the Duke of Parma, who was King Philip's nephew, with his army in the Netherlands, to dash across the Channel and march on London. Philip added a late change to the plan. Instead of staying in Ireland and covering the southwest of England, Philip insisted Medina Sidonia must sail back up the Channel to meet Parma's barges and escort them across the Channel. And Philip was the only man who believed this plan would succeed. Medina Sidonia had no idea of how he was going to rendezvous with Parma, and Parma, he'd already decided that the attack would be a failure. He was already preparing arguments as to why his men should never leave Flanders. So on May the 28th, the fleet left Lisbon with little confidence and desperately seeking a miracle. On July the 19th of 1588, Thomas Fleming was patrolling in his large oared pinnace, which was a vessel that could either be propelled by oars or sail. He was off the Scilly Isles in the western approaches, shown by the blue arrow there. He spotted a white cluster of sails on the horizon that was too many for a fishing fleet. He eventually decided they were the advance squadron of the Spanish Armada, waiting for the rest to catch up. Fleming ordered his men to make haste to Plymouth, where the Lord Admiral and his Vice Admiral, Francis Drake, waited for the English fleet. Or with the English fleet, sorry. Now, do you remember the story of Drake finishing his game of bowls before addressing the Armada? I think this picture is an early example of late 16th century camera shake. It's not very well focused, but a famous event with Sir Francis Drake shown here playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe. No one really confirmed or denied that story. It certainly added to Drake's reputation. It was true that Drake enjoyed a game of bowls, and it was probable that he knew the strong tide would not allow his ships to leave harbour, so he probably did have time to finish his game of bowls. The fact that the fleet was in Plymouth at all was, and not further up the channel, was a tribute to the character and judgment of Drake's boss, the Lord Admiral Charles Howard of Effingham. Howard was a fine Lord Admiral. He had taken office in 1585, just as the crisis with Spain was building to a climax. He loved ships, especially his flagship, the 500-ton Ark Royal. He had bought the vessel from Walter Raleigh, he of tobacco fame. It was a race-built galleon. Remember, perhaps from earlier, the race-built with a sleeker design of ship. It was a race-built galleon originally called Ark Raleigh. We also talked in the last lecture about the influence of John Fox, the staunch Protestant. Well, Howard was a former pupil of John Fox, also a staunch Protestant, and he had a shrewd ability to handle men. His principal job as Lord Admiral was procuring and outfitting ships. But he was determined to command the fleet himself. He surrounded himself with people he could trust. Chief among them was his Navy treasurer, our old friend John Hawkins. He had managed to get Hawkins and his old adversary William Winter to work together. He admired Hawkins' work with the race-built galleons, and he also understood that Hawkins and his West Country colleagues grasped the seriousness of the impending conflict with Spain. He also trusted Francis Drake. Now, Drake was a little ticked off that he wasn't in charge of the fleet. But as a commoner, he had to yield to the son of one of England's greatest families. It was Drake who told Howard that to wait for the Spanish in the Channel would be suicide. Better to be further west in Plymouth. Easy for supplies and the advantage of the weather gauge. Now, all ships must sail with the wind. In battle, being upwind means having the initiative. It allows a captain to decide whether to close and fight and how fast, depending on how much sail he puts up, or whether to turn away and wait. By contrast, the leeward captain, he that's downwind, his options are more limited. He can tack. Tacking means beating into the wind, but losing speed as you do so. He can close haul, which means shortening his sails to stand and fight, or he can run before the wind. The man with the weather gauge, the man who's to windward, dictates and controls the tempo of battle. A further advantage the English had, their captains knew their ships and their men, and passed among them with a familiarity which was strange for the 16th century. In fact, Drake had, in his voyages, had stressed that it was necessary for gentlemen and mariners to work together. Spanish ships invariably included an infantry commander. who demanded precedence over the ship's captain. This caused many disagreements, which in turn caused bad feeling and quarrels throughout the ship. Medina Sidonia, after being hampered by storms and squalls, eventually assembled his fleet off the Scillies on July the 29th. A spell of clear weather offered the Spanish a brief but golden opportunity to strike a blow at the English fleet. Captured fishermen told him that Howard and his warships were already in Plymouth, and Medina Sidonia's officers urged a surprise attack. But remember what we said about Medina Sidonia. He was missing that gene to make an independent judgment. His orders were not to enter any English port before he had met up with Palmer and his troops. So they passed by Plymouth, not realizing what an opportunity they had given up. Medina Sidonia still believed the bulk of the English fleet was further east, near the Straits of Dover. So imagine the nasty shock he had the next morning when he emerged from his cabin to find the English fleet behind him, and not as he expected, in front of him. Howard sent a small pinnace, aptly named the Disdain, to fire a charge at Medina Sidonia's flagship. It was a gesture of formal challenge, similar to a medieval knight throwing down the gauntlet. Medina Sidonia had the armada drawn up in 4 dense packed squadrons, arranged in parallel columns. The slowest hulks in the center, fighting galleons and galleasses, which were smaller versions of a galleon, on the flanks and rear. The English rushed forward, gun ports open. Each gun was aimed independently, the master gunner giving instructions to the helm. You have to remember, in those days there was no ship's wheel. The rudder was actually operated by guys lower decks who were just pushing a big beam around. And in this case, the gunner was actually in charge of steering the ship. He would issue the orders so that he could aim his guns properly. First, the bow guns fired, then the leeward guns on the side away from the wind turned, and then the guns in the stern. And as the boatswain shouted aloft to the men to luff sails and bring the ship to a halt, as the ship turned back, the other side opened fire. It was a bit like a stately pirouette as the ship went round and the guns fired as they came across their target. The ships then tacked to windward to reload. Gunners climbed over the side or squeezed through the gun ports to swab their pieces. Elizabethan guns had to be lashed in place. The ships were too narrow to allow for recoil. And in this way, English guns got off an average of 1 shot an hour. The Spaniards, keeping to their tight formations, were lucky to get off 1 shot per day. The English ships, although faster, were reluctant to get too close because of the grappling irons and the superior military power of the Spaniards. So they kept their distance, rendering their firepower ineffective. They were just blasting away with the cannonballs falling short. At the end of that first day, Medina Sidonia, although impressed with the speed and quick handling of the English ships, was pleased that his armada had kept in order. Then disaster struck. The flagship of the Andalusian squadron, the 1150-ton, 46-gun Nuestra Sonora del Rosario, was accidentally rammed by another Spanish ship, losing her bowsprit, that's the thing that sticks out in the front, her mizzen mast, that's the mast just after the main mast, and a main yard, one of the main spars that carry the sails. Then an enormous explosion shattered the evening calm. It was another flagship, the San Salvador. The entire powder magazine exploded, similar to the Almirante that we talked about at San Juan. No one ever discovered why she blew up. No English shot had touched her. There were rumors that a German gunner was mad at the captain for making passes at his wife, who was on board. And he touched off the powder magazine. There was tremendous loss of life, almost 400 soldiers and sailors. Now there was a little diversion. Drake, who had been assigned to lead the chase and had a lantern on the stern of his ship, he saw a chance for a rich prize, so he diverted to capture the abandoned Rosario and claim the bounty. He was a pirate at heart, was Francis Drake. This caused great confusion in the English fleet. Howard almost ran into the back of the Spanish fleet, and the rest of the English captains were infuriated. They spent the rest of the next day reassembling the scattered ships. They were really upset with him because he'd taken his priorities of capturing a prize over his job of leading the chase against the Spaniards. The next skirmish took place off Portland Bill, again with the Blue Arrow. The wind shifted to the northeast, giving the Spaniards the advantage. Howard and the Ark Royal veered north to catch the wind. Medina Sidonia's most powerful squadron turned on a convergent course, and Howard might have been trapped, but at the last moment the wind shifted again to the southeast and then the south-southeast, allowing Drake, Hawkins, and 50 other vessels to come to Howard's rescue. Martin Frobisher in the Triumph also ran into trouble. He found himself surrounded by 4 great oared galleasses, heavily armed, teeming with soldiers. Medina Sidonia ordered them to get close and use their grappling irons. Triumph was an older, high-charge style, similar to those vessels we were talking about last time. It had a high forecastle and a high aft castle, slow to respond to the helm, but his heavy guns saved him. The Spanish commanders warily stayed out of range. Over the next 3 days, the chase moved up the channel. It was estimated that more than 4,000 shots were fired, most with no effect. Howard was not sure where the Armada was headed. At first he thought Portland, then the Isle of Wight, and he formed his fleet into 4 squadrons. And that set a precedent for future naval squadrons. Then he set another. Instead of attacking individual pirouettes, as we talked about earlier, each squadron would advance in single file, each ship firing on the enemy and then turning away to allow the next ship to fire, and so on. Although born in a moment of frustration, this maneuver would dominate naval warfare for the next 3 centuries.